Next session is about personal narratives. We have two best-selling authors of two very different biographies, Anshel Pfeffer and Lindsey Hilsum, who will be talking about challenges and rewards of capturing someone's life. The session will be moderated by Amy Mackinnon. Amy is a staff writer for Foreign Policy magazine. She is senior editor for Coda as well. She has a Scottish background, but as I was told, American people can understand her pretty well. Is that true? Please come on stage and introduce the session and lead this wonderful talk.
Hello. Is this on? Great. Well, thank you so much for coming along to the session today. We're going to be talking about personal narratives and the huge challenge of trying to capture the life of another person and tell it kind of with truth and honesty. And so I'll just briefly introduce our guests that we have today. I won't go through their entire long, esteemed list of qualifications, but in brief, on my left is Lindsey Hilsum, the international editor of the British Channel 4 News. She's covered major wars and refugee movements of the past 3 decades, including Syria, Ukraine, Mali, Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and as well as the Arab Spring uprisings in Libya and Egypt. Her first book was Sandstorm, Libya in the Time of Revolution, but the book that we are here to talk about today is In Extremis, the life of war correspondent Marie Colvin. Marie Colvin was the legendary Sunday Times correspondent who was tragically killed in Homs in Syria in 2012 when the house that she was staying in was shelled by Assad's forces. Colvin was a longtime friend and colleague of Lindsey's, and the book is based in part on Marie Colvin's own diaries. Also joined today by Anshel Pfeffer, who is senior correspondent and columnist from Haaretz and the Israel correspondent of The Economist and a regular contributor to the London Times, the Sunday Times, and the Jewish Chronicle. He's been reporting on Israeli and international affairs for 22 years and has reported from over 30 countries, including, as I learned yesterday, my native Scotland for the independence referendum, and Georgia, yes, and the Georgian War, right? Yes. Anshel is also the author of the critically acclaimed biography of Bibi, the Turbulent Life and Times of Benjamin Netanyahu, which traces the arc of Netanyahu's life and also through that of Israel. Right, over to you guys. I'll begin with an easy one. How did you go about choosing the subject for your biographies? I mean, why did these two individuals stand out to you?
Okay, well, let me start by saying something about Marie. I don't know if you can see the cover, but I've been missing her the last 2 days because, as you can see, she's wearing an eye patch. So every time I've been out at the protests and seen these people with the eye patches, I've been thinking about Marie. Her eye was shot when she was crossing a front line in the war in Sri Lanka in 2001. And she would have loved to have been here today and seen everybody with their eye patches. And one of the things that she did was she had an eye patch studded with rhinestones, especially for parties. And so at last night's session, where I have to say I was in bed much earlier than Anshel, Marie would have been out with Anshel until the early hours with her eye patch with rhinestones on. I have no doubt about that. So that's, I guess, why I wanted to write about her, because she was a very intriguing character. She was a friend of mine. And to tell a very brief story, in February 2012, it was when uprising was morphing into civil war in Syria, and I had dinner with Marie in Beirut. There were 4 of us: Jim Muir of the BBC, Neil McFarker of the New York Times, some of you will know him, has been Moscow correspondent until very recently, Marie and myself. And the talk was all about getting smuggled into Bab Ammar, which was the place which was being besieged by Assad's forces at the time. And 3 of us said, it's beyond our danger threshold. It's crazy. You know, the people smugglers will sell you to jihadis. It's incredibly dangerous. And Marie said, anyway, it's what we do. And so she went in and the rest of us didn't. She not only went in, she came out, filed her story, and went back in. And that was when she was killed, when she went back in. And she haunted me. She was my friend who had been so much braver than I was. And yet, she was dead and I was alive. And over the time that followed, I just couldn't get her out of my mind. And I had an injury, and I was lying on my sofa with my injury, thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to write? And I wanted to write about one person in the context of the conflicts which I had seen. And I realized it was staring me in the face. It was Marie. I had to write about Marie. So that was what I did.
I'm feeling a bit daunted sitting here with at least two other great biographies in this room. And I think that why write a book about something? I really had a dilemma about whether to write this book, because if anyone's read this book so far, they know I'm very critical of Netanyahu, and obviously not a huge fan. I appreciate some sides of his character, and he's obviously an evil genius. But there's a feeling that when you're taking on a book, when you're writing a biography, you're creating some sort of an intimacy with your subject, and I was sort of afraid of feeling too close to a politician who I don't particularly like or support. But I really wanted to write the book because I've been, as you said at the beginning when you introduced me, I've been 22 years reporting in Israel, and it's dominated. There's one man who's really dominated all that period in ways that even strong and prominent politicians very rarely dominate a country, and in dominating the narrative and sucking the oxygen out of the Israeli political and social agenda. And I wanted to write a book about Israel in that period, and I knew the only really efficient and I think just the best way to reflect that period was just through his life, and that's why I decided to write the book.
I was interested when I was reading the book. I mean, you're still working in Israel, and as you say, take quite a critical eye to Netanyahu. I mean, did you ever have any point when you were writing it where you thought, God, if this doesn't go down well, no one in this town is going to talk to me again? Or, I mean, how did you juggle that, your kind of ongoing responsibility to your job as a journalist that has to keep working in Israel, but also giving a kind of accurate account, as you saw it?
I mean, worse books have been written about Netanyahu, worse as they're not as good as my book, but even more critical of him. Israel's a very weird kind of democracy. On the one hand, there's the occupation of the Palestinians, lack of civil rights and even like religious rights, which sort of pushes it way down the democracy charts. And then you have freedom of expression and strength of the courts under the electoral system, which sort of put it on the top. And if you look at some of the charts which sort of analyze democracy, there is no other country with that kind of discrepancy. So you're not really taking a risk by writing a book about Netanyahu. In many ways, because Israel is so really split down the middle between people who love and admire and support Bibi and the other half of Israelis who can't stand the man, you're actually running the risk of falling afoul of both sides. And a lot of the criticism I've got for the book has actually come from people who are even bigger critics of Netanyahu, saying, no, you went too easy him on this point. That point, why did you let him off? Why did you say good things about him? And, I think the argument is that when you write a book about any person, well, almost any person, you'll always find something good to say about him, or the book won't be very authentic.
And Lindsey, when I was reading your biography of Marie, I felt like you kind of had several hats when it came to Marie. You were a longtime friend, but as you say, you were also a colleague working in many of the similar areas together. But you also became her biographer, and you are yourself a journalist with a critical eye. I mean, how did you balance all of those different approaches?
Well, I was in Marie's outer circle, not her inner circle. I was invited to parties, but not dinner parties. And I think that if I had been in her inner circle, I wouldn't have been able to write the book, because I would have had this fixed view of her. And I also would have been really worried about damaging her reputation. But believe me, she had done so much to damage her own reputation during her life. What was I supposed to do? She was not Saint Marie. By no means. And the book is called In Extremis because that was something she wrote, that what she covered as a reporter was the lives of people living in extremis in war. But she lived her own life in extremis when it came. I mean, basically, the book is about love and war and sex and death. That's what it's about. Those are the themes. And I knew Marie well enough to know that if I had not put in the tangled love affairs, the times that she behaved extremely badly, her irresponsibility sometimes towards herself, it wouldn't be true. And one thing about Marie was that she was a very good journalist. She tried to get to what John Lee Anderson was talking about, the truth. She always did that. She sometimes, interestingly enough, made up stories about her own life, usually for effect. And I was caught out a couple of times. And this, I think, is a theme that comes up in both books, which is, and also mentioned in the last session, which is about myth. Because there's somebody like Bibi, who is so famous, everybody has a view of him already. So in a sense, what you're doing is you're puncturing the myth. You're looking for the real man. But then with Marie, who was well known in the UK, but not outside, I felt I was trying to do two things at once. On the one hand, I'm obviously building a myth. Look at her with her eye patch. She looks mythological. She is this sort of consummate, crazy, glamorous female war correspondent in the tradition of Martha Gellhorn and Lee Miller. There's a whole myth there. But then, I'm also puncturing that myth because I'm showing how vulnerable she was and how the central dilemma of her life was that she had this image which she bought into, which the Sunday Times to some extent created for her. And yet inside there were times when she just felt like a vulnerable little girl and she could not cope with that dichotomy. So I'm building the myth and destroying it at the same time.
And a lot of the book, or parts of the book, are based on Marie's own diaries. I mean, how did you kind of work with the family in getting them? And
yeah.
And were you, as you were writing, were they in the back of your mind thinking, what will they think?
Well, when Marie left a mess after she died, of course, and, boyfriends and ex-husbands and sisters and friends and all of them at each other's throats, none of which I went into in the book. I thought, when she dies, that's the end of the book. But I realized that I was in a unique position, which is that for some reason everybody trusted me. The last boyfriend, the family, the best friend who was also the executor of the will. And so I was very lucky in that way that people did trust me, and they knew that I would be honest, and they also knew that it would not be a hagiography, and that I would try and tell Marie's story as honestly as I could. And she had left her documents, including her diaries, to the last boyfriend, who very kindly let me have access to them. But then I went to Long Island, which is where she was brought up, and her mother very kindly and her younger sister let me into the basement of the house, which is still the house which Marie grew up in, and take away all these documents. I was living on Long Island for 4 months to do the research. And I think this is a sort of moment if I say in a biographer's life, it sounds like I think I am a biographer. I've never written one before. But I found this child's diary with a sort of off-white plastic cover, which was locked with a little key. And I couldn't find the key anywhere. I had to slice through it with a knife. And as I opened it, I realized this was Marie's first diary, written at the age of 13. And I realized that no one would have looked at that since she locked it with that little missing key, maybe at the age of 14 or 15. And this diary, I just loved it, because I began to recognize in this rebellious little girl, the woman who I knew later. And I think my favorite entry is very short. She was the eldest of 5 children in a Catholic family. They had to go to church every Sunday. And she writes, "To church, wore Minnie, the mother and the father no like." And I thought, yes, that's my girl.
And Anshel, when, in the beginning of your book, there's an incredible amount of historical detail about the Netanyahu family. How did you go about, doing your research for the book, and especially those historic years, and also where do you draw the line at what to include from somebody's life and family history, and where do you say maybe not so relevant?
Let me just say first of all about Marie. I knew Marie slightly when she was reporting in the Middle East, and for me reading Lindsey's book was sort of like, oh, that rumor about Marie was true. Oh, that rumor as well. Oh, that story everyone said, that was true as well. So
Sadly, most of the stories were true.
I think that, to your question, Amy, I think when we sit down to write a biography, and books, they look thick, they seem to have a lot of space in them. You get 400 or 500 pages to fill. Usually the contract also says, don't cross this number of words. Nowadays, publishers really don't want to have to sell, except if you're Robert Caro, nobody really wants to have to sell very thick biographies. But you begin thinking, how am I going to fill all this space? And I've got to do all this research and learn up in the family and the people around him, and find out new and hidden details. And very quickly, you reach the stage where you have the opposite problem. How am I going to get all this in? Because you collect and just also the things that people don't know about. But when you're writing a book about a figure, if it's a historical figure or a political figure, you actually have to also go back and tell what you think people do know, because you have to put them in context. It's a bit like the dilemma we have when any piece we write is how much are we going to put of new stuff in, how much are we going to go back and put in background and context. And very quickly you have no room left in your book, and you're slashing. And I think every biographer and every writer of a non-fiction book finds him or herself in the last few weeks before handing in the manuscript just murdering your darlings. Originally I had twice as much about Netanyahu's family, both his father and grandfather and his wife. Obviously I had 3 times as much about his wife. And you really try and see what's essential, both in the building up of the myth, and Lindsey put a finger on it. A lot of writing a biography is analyzing how the myth was built, why was it built, and then breaking down the myth and showing the real person behind it. And what I try to do in those chapters about Netanyahu's grandfather and father is really hack away at the myth and show that this is how Netanyahu today presents his dad and his grandfather, and what they've sort of bequeathed to him. This is what they really were, and this is what they were, and this is the real person they've made out. And it's it's a constant challenge and dilemma what bits to leave in. I wanted to put in entire scenes of the places where Netanyahu had grown up in Jerusalem and on Long Island himself as well. He spent a year as a kid, and then in Philadelphia. And most of that I had to cut out because there was no room for that kind of scene. Maybe if I ever write the director's version, then I can.
But one of the things which I thought was really interesting, and which is a contrast with the Marie book, is it's so important, the grandfather and the father in particular, because you're telling the story of Israel through the eyes of this family and through the way this family sees itself in the history. And so much of Netanyahu's political persona is about where he comes from and who he is and who he comes from. So it's absolutely critical. Whereas I wrote quite a lot initially about Marie's grandparents and the Irish background. In the end, I got rid of all of that because it wasn't really very important. I mean, every now and then she kind of talked up her sort of Irish background, mainly in order to get close to Arafat. She would pretend that her grandfather was some great freedom fighter. Load of bollocks. He was nothing of the sort. But, you know, it had to be mentioned in that way. But actually, it's not important. The childhood is important, but the history of the family isn't. Whereas with Netanyahu, it's absolutely critical.
I mean, that's always the same. But I found in your book, Lindsey, that and this is something I didn't know about Marie, and I told you last night. Marie once invited me to go sailing with her. Just like, we're going sailing tomorrow, do you want to join? I just thought, who's got time to go sailing? We've got to work. And then when I read your book and all those wonderful descriptions of what it was like to go sailing with Marie, and I think, I had that chance, I didn't take it. And this is like these are the things that we choose to put in the book, and they really illuminate the character. Why is it so important that Marie loves sailing? And Lindsey really brings that thing to life in the book.
The sailing theme was so important. She learned to sail as a child. And she loved it, and it was this freedom for her. But also, what she did to relax when she wasn't war corresponding was ocean racing, which is the only kind of sailing which is probably more dangerous than war corresponding. So that's Marie for you. But there was this freedom about it. And actually, there's a poem at the beginning, a Dorothy Parker poem, an alternative title for the book was in that poem, but I was against it, which was about, it's about being on the water and the storm and the loving of sailing into the storm. And Marie loved that. She writes about it in her diary. She loved to sail into a storm. But then the sort of breaking up in the wind and the danger in your face. And the line is a reckless tide. And I thought a reckless tide would be another very good title for this book. But the publisher preferred this one.
So a question for both of you, because I think it's something that you handled really well, but it's something that I always struggle with as a writer, is how do you avoid the tyranny of chronology, especially when you're telling a life of somebody which, naturally is bound by time, but I think you both managed to capture the salient moments and really kind of inject color at critical points, but without getting hung up on and then this, and then this, and then this. How do you choose what to kind of leave out and how to keep the pace going?
Well, I think whenever you're writing a book, and I think biographies, it's really key, you spend a lot of the time not just research and writing, you spend really thinking how you want the book to flow, how, what's the narrative of it. And I spent about 2 years just trying to work out how to write that. And you begin, like I said before, you begin thinking, I'm going to have every little detail in that person's life. I'm going to meet and interview every single person he ever met and ever worked with him. And then it's just going to be this incredible compendium of facts and figures and quotes. And then you very quickly realize there's no way you're going to fit that in a book. And nobody wants to read that, except you're writing about LBJ and your name is Caro. Nobody wants to read that kind of book. And then you think, okay, so how am I going to write this book? Because now I have to start selecting and working out my narrative. And that I was really stuck on that for a long time. And so I'd like to say I remember the eureka moment, but it did dawn on me at a certain moment that I'm writing a book about Israel, I'm writing a book about a person. This person was born literally the year after Israel was born. His life is parallel to the life of the state. His father and his grandfather are the two early periods of Zionism. His grandfather was the founding of political Zionism, and his father was the transition between the idea of Zionism to the state of Israel. And then Netanyahu's life spans Israel. So there you are. There's your answer. And you write the book as a history of Israel through Netanyahu's eyes. And I think every writer has to find that point where you can work out how to take a person's life and put it in a broader context, whether it's a place, whether it's a time, whether it's history. And I was just lucky that Netanyahu's life just works well for that kind of narrative.
I mean, mine was slightly different because I'm sort of raising a question which I don't really answer, or not fully, which is why did she go back to Baba Rama for the second time? What compelled her? What drove her? And so, and I had to start, in the preface with the story I told you with the last time I saw her. And that story continues because I spoke to her on Skype just a few hours before she was killed. And then the other sort of very dramatic moment for me was when she lost her eye. So at the beginning of the book, that's the other extreme moment in her life. What makes somebody take this risk that they actually lose part of their eyesight? But then chronology was my friend, because then I basically decided, I'm trying to answer those questions, and you have to show what happens and what happened next, and one thing builds on another. And one thing I'm sort of weirdly proud of is my Excel spreadsheet of chronology, because sometimes with her diaries, she didn't actually date them or say where they were. So I'm working through. Now, luckily, I was in a lot of the same places at the same time. And so I can look at this undated diary and think, yeah, I remember interviewing somebody called Mohammed in Gaza. That must have been, I know that happened. That must have been 2006. So I could work out the dates as we went along. But the chronology, because Marie was a reporter covering all these different conflicts, East Timor, Chechnya, Kosovo, and so on. My chronology is the events which she covered and the big things that happened in the world plotted next to her life. So the chronology will go, marries Patrick Bishop in Oyster Bay, such and such a war breaks out, or such and such a world leader is assassinated. So I can see how all the things fit together, but the chronology had to be fairly strict, or else the life makes no sense.
And again, for both of you, I mean, in both books you're dealing with things which happened many, many decades ago. How did you approach the issue of fact-checking or verifying accounts that you got from those years?
I mean, this is really where it comes to that the publisher you're working with, the editors you're working, are so crucial. And we don't talk. I think as writers, we don't talk enough about the quality of editors we have, and they make a huge difference. And it's first of all just having someone who commissions you, which makes you feel very very committed and daunted when starting out, but it's someone to talk to. And the most crucial parts, your editor or editors and the people working with you. If you're fortunate enough to be working with really good fact checkers, and the people who edited my book were fantastic, it becomes a huge nuisance. You spend weeks and sometimes months with questions, with literally thousands of questions. But then when you see how many mistakes they've saved you from making, not just factual, but sometimes you just say the wrong. You're writing such a long book, and now when I read a book written by someone else, I can, and I know that so and so is a good writer. I think he was let down by his fact checkers.
Yeah, it's just, look, I mean, I had the diaries, which were a contemporaneous record, and that was very useful, particularly on stories which Marie told later. And I would go on the whole, I went with the contemporaneous record because, the mythology thing as well. And obviously I interviewed, husbands, ex-husbands and friends and family and everybody. And there were some things which I couldn't compute. I just couldn't work out what really happened. And some of those things I just had to leave out because I just couldn't figure it out. There are mistakes in there. There's one mistake, which is corrected in the paperback version, which was because Marie told a lie about her own life. And I believed her. And then somebody came up afterwards and said that wasn't true and managed to prove to me why it could not have been true. God, I was angry with her at that point. But then I was angry with myself because I think a bit of me knew that story wasn't quite true. It was too good to leave out. And so, it's a very difficult process. And then you get, and then there are some, a couple of things where I could kick myself and my publishers, because there's a Marine base which is mentioned, which is not in North Carolina, it's in California. I got it wrong. And so you have things like that. And then you have the really annoying post facto fact checkers, like the man who wrote to me the day before yesterday to tell me that the pub in New York where she used to drink, the Lion's Head, was not dingy. Go figure.
So, I mean, as this festival is about the future of storytelling, I wanted to kind of look towards the future of biography writing. And I mean, you mentioned that a large part of much as these two books are very different in many ways, what they have in common is they're kind of looking at these myths around these two kind of very remarkable individuals in their own different ways. But now with social media, people are even more able to create their own public myths. How do you think that's going to change the role of the biographer in the future? Do you think it's going to become even more important to have a kind of independent record of a person's life separate from their own?
Well, one of the things that's going to be very difficult is so few people keep written diaries now, and I did not have, Marie's computer was destroyed when she was killed in Syria. And so there's lots of emails that she had written to friends, which would have been really useful and revealing. But I didn't come to writing this until it was too late to try and, get access to her emails, and there was no computer. And so actually a lot of the latest stuff, if there hadn't been the diaries, there would have been no record. And I think this is going to be a massive challenge to biographers in the future, because there's so much stuff online. is somebody, and are you going to, judge a person's life or use their Twitter feed? I think not. You say very different things in a Twitter feed to what you would say in a diary. You say very different things in an email than you would in a letter. I mean, think about the great biographies of the past, which are based on people's letters. Sometimes I wonder, the Bloomsbury set, did they ever do anything but write each other letters? I mean, they spent the whole bloody day writing letters, and the rest of the time they were gardening. So, it's yeah, so it's extraordinary. So I think it's going to be really difficult. And because social media is a lot about creating the myth of ourselves in the moment, I think it's going to be much harder to know what's true about a life.
I mean, we used to have papers of record, and some newspapers still feel they are the paper of record, but nowadays we know there is no paper of record anymore, there is no paper anymore, and if you're writing about a contemporary figure who is active in politics and in society, then the amount of material you'll have will be, you simply won't be able to even download and keep it all in one place, let alone read and analyze and somehow bring it into your own biography. But when we talk now about the future biography, and Lindsey talked about, do you judge someone by his Twitter feed? We have someone now who's running the US, if not the world, and, well, not actually running it, but the most powerful man in the world. And he was defined by his own autobiography, which obviously he didn't write himself, The Art of the Deal. And that book obviously created a massive myth that is not the real Donald Trump. Other people have wrote books about him. There are at least 3 or 4 biographies written about him before he became a candidate to be president. So it's obvious that biographies still play and will continue to play a big role in defining public figures. And I think for us as journalists and as writers, there's something about writing a biography which is the ultimate act of journalism, because the whole time we're telling stories about people, we're telling stories about powerful people, we're trying to bring them to account, we're trying to bring them down to ground, down to earth, and treat them as real human beings. And I think the ultimate way of doing that, there's no more comprehensive way of doing that, is writing a biography. And in a sense, I think it's a very hostile act. Even if you're writing a biography from a position of empathy, as Lindsey did, or writing it from a position of very intense criticism, as I did, it doesn't matter. You're forcing your own narrative on another human being. You're taking someone's life and you're telling the story. You're not letting... And one of the last times I actually met Netanyahu while writing on the book, he didn't cooperate with the book, but as being a journalist, I met him quite often. We were in briefings, and I was a couple of times on foreign trips with him. And he said to me something like, "I'm going to write my own biography, not you." Yeah. And that was a very telling moment, also because of the man he is. He doesn't want anybody else. He's the son of an historian. He wants to control the narrative. But I think any normal person would not be very happy about someone writing their biography.
I mean, that's what Peter Pomerantz and John Lee were talking about in the last session, and I totally agree with what Peter was saying, which was, because I also work in television, that the moment somebody sees themselves on television, they don't see the person that they think they are, and they're rather shocked. And it may just be that they didn't realize that double chin was so bad, or that they don't like their squeaky voice, but the way they said something wasn't the way they meant to say it, because what they have in their head is different from what actually came out. And so I think one of the main rules is to make sure you write a biography of someone who's already dead, because then they can't come back and complain, even if the family can.
And so I've one final question, and I think we can open it. I have no idea what the time is. You've got... we're good, yeah. We're in Georgian time. I mean, I've never written a biography, but it strikes me that, you examine another person's life in even more granular detail than you would, say, your own, or even those, your spouse or those in your own life. Did that ever get a bit... You have a great story on this, which I'm hoping you will tell. But for both of you, did that ever at any point get a little bit weird, where you're spending so much time thinking about Netanyahu, about Marie Colvin?
Well, Netanyahu...
Netanyahu in your head. Do you dream about him?
I began dreaming about him after writing the book, in the way that a lot of us I know have this nightmare that we're 17 and we're back in high school and we've still got to do our final exam in mathematics. And I stopped dreaming that when I started writing this book, and now I do often dream about Netanyahu chasing after me in various forms.
Actually, he really is after you. That's not a dream, it's
Not
true.
physically, but sort of like I'm being pursued. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes the nightmare is actually something, having some kind of a positive meeting with him, which is in itself a nightmare. But towards the end of writing the book, and I had to, because as Lindsey said, it's difficult writing. It's very different writing a book about someone who's dead or someone who's alive. And you have to keep it somehow up to date. And the whole time I was wondering, will Netanyahu lose? So I signed the contract to write the book immediately after he won the election in 2015. And the whole time, will he lose another election? Will he be forced to resign? And then how do I end the book? And then it's going to come out. Will people even want to read the book about the man when he's no longer in power? And ultimately, he still is the prime minister. How do you keep it up to date? So towards the end of the work, that was when the current corruption cases began coming out, and I knew a lot of the details before they were coming out. But what was really what made it really fun to try and get into the book, those last details, were every time the gifts that he's been receiving that he may well be indicted and even go to prison for, there were lots of lovely little details about the kind of champagne that his wife would demand and the kind of cigars that he smokes. And one detail was that people were buying him Xenia suit, $2,000 Xenia suits, and in a very bizarre way, when that was coming out, I had just inherited from my grandfather a beautiful old silken wool Xenia jacket, much too big for me. I was thinking maybe next time I go see Netanyahu, maybe I'll take, it probably fits him. My granddad has a similar build, and I can also be on the list of people giving you illegal gifts. So I haven't had the chance to do that yet, but I'm still hoping.
Mine is also about clothes. So all writers have their rituals for not writing, whether it's making one more cup of coffee or deciding that you've got to clean the house or whatever. I mean, mine nearly used up all of my advance because it is online shopping. So much of the morning is spent saying, oh God, I think I really need, anyway. And so I really need a leather jacket. I've never had a leather jacket in my life. Anyway, so I look through and I find a really lovely leather jacket. Oh, yeah, I can afford it with the advance. And so I buy the leather jacket, and a few days later it arrives, and I put it on, and I look in the mirror, I go, shit, this is Marie's leather jacket. This is actually not the kind of jacket I would normally buy. This is one which is very similar to one she wore, I often saw her in. And I realized that there was that very spooky moment that I was putting on her clothes. But, I felt, then I wear it often. It's my Marie jacket. I don't have it with me, but I wear it often. And I think that's fine, because you can put it on and you can take it off again. And I suppose that is also what the art of biography is about. It's putting it on, trying to understand how the world looked through her eyes, and taking it off and being the journalist and stepping back and being critical again.
Well, I think now I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions in the audience. Is there a roving microphone? Yes. Yeah? Okay, great. So there's one. Sorry, okay, and then, yeah.
Hi, Lindsey. I really loved your book, and I was just wondering if you might be able to tell the audience a little bit about Marie's connection with Tbilisi, because I think it's a fascinating story for those who haven't read in Extremis.
Well, her story with Tbilisi about going to Chechnya. Yeah, absolutely. So 1999 was an extraordinary year for Marie. She started off in Kosovo, where she was very nearly killed. Then she was in East Timor, where she was very nearly killed. And then she was in Chechnya, where she was very nearly killed. And she came through Tbilisi to get there because she went in with the rebels. And what it was crazy. The rest of us, I also covered the war in Chechnya. I'm sure other people here did too. I did it from the border with Ingushetia and occasionally just going, in across that border with the Russians. But no, not Marie. Marie went in with the rebels under Russian bombardment, which was extraordinarily dangerous. And then she had done this, and she'd got extraordinary stories. And And she was working with a photographer called Dima Belyakov, who had never been through anything like this before, and never worked with a woman like Marie before, who, you know, with the sort of the Chechen, the sort of hardline Chechen jihadi types were not at all sure about this, you know, woman smoking and, you know, just falling asleep and lying wherever she did, just, you know, it was all very difficult for them. Anyway, they realized they've got as far as they can towards Grozny, and they need to get back, and the road to Georgia has been cut. So what are they going to do? There's only two ways out, and they're both being, through Ingushetia and Dagestan, they're being bombed. And they say, well, the only way back is to walk through the mountains. It's the end of December. I mean, how deep is the snow here? And so Marie and Dima and the guide start to walk back through the mountains. And she kept her diary at this point is just extraordinary, because when Marie knew she was doing something which was exceptional, her handwriting changed. It became very, very small and very precise in case she runs out of pages. And so she would stop, I don't know, every few hours or whatever, and she would write in huge detail what had happened. The moment when Dima lies down and says, I can't go any further. And she screams at him to get up because she knows that despair will lead to death. And then he calls her a very, very rude word indeed. And that was the last time they spoke on that trip. So now they're walking in silence through the snow. And then there's an entry in the diary, which I just love, which is, so they finally crossed into Georgia and they're over the border, but they're still not safe because nobody knows where they are. And she writes in great detail about how they're going to survive. Will they get red berries? Murad, the guide, has a pistol. Maybe they can kill animals. There's some flour in the corner. Maybe they can, you know, mix that up with some water and make something to eat. So this is the Girl Scout in Marie, and she was a Girl Scout back in Long Island. And then she realizes it's Christmas Eve, and she thinks about the people she loves, and she wonders if they love her. And she writes about her mother. She says, Mom, if she knows, we'll have a terrible Christmas. And she's living with her ex-husband, with whom she's back together again, Patrick, at this point. She says, I should be cooking Christmas dinner in Paris. I know he'll be worried, but he'll also be furious. I wonder if he really does love me. And to me, this is the most touching moment. So there she is in the most extreme situation you can imagine, worrying about whether her man loves her or not. Just like any woman in this room, just worrying about that. And that she's so utterly vulnerable and human at that moment. In the end, what happens is that they are rescued by the American embassy in Tbilisi. Marie said that she'd never felt more grateful to be an American, not a Brit, because of course the Brits were completely useless. They didn't give a toss. But this sort of Ernest Hemingway type figure sort of appears in a helicopter and says, Miss Colvin, I presume. And they get on the plane. They don't want to let the Chechens on the plane, but Marie insists, and they say no arms on the plane. But Marie has managed to secrete the Chechen guide's pistol at this point. Otherwise, she knows they won't search her, but they'll search him. And so they get back to Tbilisi and drink vodka and eat caviar, and everything is fine. And she and Dima make up, and you know, everything's fine, and she goes to her room and she calls Patrick, and they have the most massive row of their entire relationship.
I think Neil was, he had a question.
Hi, my question is for Lindsey. I want to ask about something I'm sure you've gotten a lot, which is the almost concurrent film dramatization of Marie's life. And this, I've not seen the film itself, but as far as I'm aware, the film takes a pretty starkly different view, and it paints Marie as this very heroic, you know, white against black sort of character, and not with the sort of, as you've done, with the sort of, you know, human with all her inherent complexities. And I'm wondering, how do you deal with something like that, especially when it's done by, when there's a biography coming out on the same subject, at the same time taking a very different view, and especially when it's, as I assume, with a major film studio, something that's done with a lot more financial resources behind it?
Yeah, look, the film, it's quite interesting. And that's what I'm talking about, the myth of Marie. So whatever, me trying to build a myth up and knock it down, and then you have a Hollywood film. Hey, that's a myth, right? So the film was based on a Vanity Fair article, which was written shortly after she was killed and was optioned by the Charlize Theron's company. And Marie is played by Rosamund Pike, who is absolutely brilliant. I mean, she really, she studied Marie, anything of Marie that you could see on YouTube, and there was quite a lot, and she got her mannerisms and so on. It was really good. And Marie would have absolutely loved to be played by a very beautiful actress. She would have liked that tremendously. But the film is very much let down by the script, which is not great. I mean, people, the Marie character wanders around, going, I'm telling the first rough draft of history. And, it's all bollocks. And keeps explaining herself to the people she's interviewing, this is what we're doing. Whereas actually, in real life, Marie interviewed people like we all interview people. Your own character isn't important. You ask the questions of the person. And in the film, time has collapsed. And if she's not being shot at, she's getting pissed. It's, she did drink too much, but, it's very difficult to film in that way. There's another film, which is absolutely brilliant. So Paul Conroy, who is the photographer she was with on that last fateful journey into Bab Ammar in Homs in Syria, he wrote a book about that called Under the Wire, and a documentary was made. And that is brilliant. It's utterly brilliant. And what makes it brilliant is that, some of it is reconstruction, and some of it is footage that Paul filmed. But then, of course, in Syria, everybody has their iPhones. And Chris Martin, who lives in Beirut, who's the director, he was sort of casting around for footage, and somebody gave him a thumb drive. And on it was all the pictures that the Syrians in Bab Ammar had taken of Marie and Paul. So you see Marie, in the real Marie, interviewing refugees, interviewing people as she really did, and it's heart-stopping. And that is an absolutely brilliant film. So I would recommend that one more than the Hollywood version. But somebody contacted me the other day about making a play. So hey, the myth of Marie keeps going.
Hello. One more question. The difference between those two books, one of the differences is that you really had lived moments with your personage. As John Lee was saying, you're always trying to leave some interesting moments with your personage to understand.
Can you hold the microphone closer because we can't hear?
No, what I'm saying is that you had some moments lived with her. Yeah, you saw her in life moments, let's say, and you work with your personage from distance, let's say. So how you see the difference between those approaches and how you lead with this when you write a biography?
I think whenever you're writing about a person, so if you're writing at book's length, you're creating a relationship with that person. And I sometimes felt that I was actually happy that Netanyahu turned down all my requests for cooperation because it would have created a different kind of relationship with him, and I wanted that kind of. I mean, obviously, you have to ask if you're writing about someone who's alive, you have to tell them, I'm writing a book about you, and will you sit down and talk to me? I was not surprised when they ignored and his office and more personal entreaties were also turned down. But it's easier to write when you don't have that kind of relationship, I think. And on those occasions when I did meet Netanyahu in person, when I was writing, and he knew I was writing the book, he always found a way of sort of kind of like making a snide comment. So once he said to me, you're writing a book about me, but you don't know anything about me. It's going to be a cartoon. Everybody will laugh at you. And the other time he said to me, I'm going to write the book about myself. And once, when I was actually sitting in his office in a very small group of journalists were talking to him, and he noted, and he is a very clever man, and he was talking about something to do with Iran and the nuclear weapons and so on, and he noticed that I was writing something, but it wasn't what he was saying. And he immediately zeroed on me. You're taking down details of what I have in my office, right? And I was like, he was right. They said, it's okay, I'll let you roam around afterwards when we finish. Obviously, the moment he finishes briefing, we were all thrown out of the office. But you have this relationship, and it enriches the book, but it also makes it more difficult, I think, to create the distance that you need and to write. But we're writing about human beings. We're not writing about atoms and and objects that we this is something that you need all the nuance and the color you can bring in, and you need also to work on yourself not to be too affected by it. And I think Lindsey also
Yeah, but
many of those can experience
I think this is an interesting thing because I thought I have to be honest about my friendship with Marie and also my right to write the book. And I felt that my right to write the book was about the sort of last encounters that we had just before she was killed, and also the friendship that we had. But, you know, it's not about me, and it's not about my relationship with her. So what I did was at there's a preface where basically I go through my relationship with Marie, how we met and so on, which is also quite a funny story, but you'll have to buy the book to read it. And
you should.
thank you. And but the rest of it, I'm not there because I wasn't there. And it's not about me, it's about her. And so that was how I decided to do it, to make that a sort of quite a clear line between the bit which is about our friendship and then her life.
How are we doing for time? Is anyone keeping time? Yes. What does that mean? No more? Okay.
The lady at the back says no, the lady at the front says yes.
Well, maybe we'll take one more then. There was one.
One more. Why this lady here?
I feel very conflicted. Okay, Rehan, go for it.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the process of writing. You were talking about chronology and
Can you hold the microphone closer so people can hear?
Yes, of course. Sorry. I have a question about the process of writing. You were talking about the chronology and all the research that you had to do. Were you writing at the same time, or did you gather all your research in both cases? And also, Lindsey, a question for you. If Marie read your book, what sort of entry do you think she would have made in her diary or told you directly in your face? Thank you very much.
It's very difficult, I think, to say, this is when I'm researching, this is when I'm making my plan and working out what the chronology and the content will be, and this is when I'm writing. It sort of fuses together. Maybe there probably are much more disciplined writers than I am, but I don't find that I'm capable of really putting them in separate periods. And anybody who's ever written even just 100 words little news brief knows that you're looking at the empty screen and you don't believe you'll ever manage to finish those 100 words. You need to put something on the screen really quickly to boost your confidence. So quite often you find that even before you're doing the research, you're writing a few lines, a sequence here or there, just to you'll feel you've got something. The thought that you haven't put anything down yet, that this massive book is still empty of words is unbearable. You need to write.
Yes.
Obviously, you finish writing as well, but I think you need to write something at the beginning just to feel that you've put some words down on the screen or on paper, and it's that gives you the feeling that you can carry on.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's a proposal for the publisher and so on, and so some of that goes in the thing. But yeah, I did a lot of research, but then the sort of moment to start writing, I spent 4 months on Long Island where Marie was brought up. I had a fellowship at a university there, and I was wandering around an arboretum, which is where she was in the Girl Scouts, and I'd been doing lots of research and lots of interviews and people, and I was just walking. And for me, the process walking is a very important part of the process of writing. I can't write unless I walk. I have to walk. That's where I do my thinking. And I suddenly found I had to write the beginning, and I sat on a bench and I took my iPhone and I just wrote the first few lines. And I don't even know if they were the ones that stayed or not, but there was a moment when I had to write. It was kind of, it had stewed enough. And another thing about timing is that, John Lee was talking earlier about how much time you spend with people to get their confidence and so on. That's true. But there's also a moment where you can lose people's confidence if you don't get on with it, and they can change their minds. And I was aware of that with people who were close to Marie. I thought that, these people, all of my friends now, they're certainly not all going to be my friends later on down the line. And sure enough, some of them aren't anymore. But you have to sort of, I felt I had to get on with it. People wanted this book to come out. And what would Marie think? Look, I have no idea. I can't channel Marie. But the thing I would say was that after she was killed, there was such a lot of coverage of how she died, of her death. And she was becoming a martyr. And I felt uncomfortable about that. And I think she would have felt uncomfortable about that. again, back on the film, one of the problems with the film is that in the film, she's not funny. But you know what? She was the funniest person I ever met. And she was somebody who, whenever you got somewhere, you think, and you bump into Marie, you think, oh, good, we're going to have fun. You remember that, don't you? You would go to the American Colony Bar with her, and you would laugh. And so I hope that she would like that in the book, it was important to me that I brought out her sense of humor, that she wasn't just this tragic, troubled character, although she was that as well. And because so much of the coverage was about this violent and tragic nature of her death, what I wanted to do in the book was to bring her back to life.
One memory I have from Marie, because it came back to me the other night when we were running outside the parliament when tear gas was coming down. And I remember standing with Marie in one of those alleyways off the Bourguiba Avenue in Tunis in the first days of what was then still called the Arab Spring. And the tear gas there was much was much heavier and vicious than the one they had here. But I remember like running into that, and Marie was like running beside me. She said, "Is this a wonderful time to be alive?" And she meant it.
Well, on that note, I think we should wrap up. Can you get a big round of applause, please, for our two guests here?